He indicated as much as Jonathan, he was out of state about gambling. So Jonathan turned around and texted this guy he works with. By the way, he's coming. That's a confirmation he's coming.
Okay, it's time to begin. We get David to be quiet.
Yeah. Here we go, Mr. Moderator.
See, that was the problem, he's a moderator.
I did. I had to tell you when I was moderating the debate, I had to get on to him because he was supposed to ask a question, and he went off preaching. And I go, "You got a question?" So I had to cut him
I
off.
had to make my points. Respond to him and then ask the questions.
Okay, we're in Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12. We have been noticing the different audiences that Jesus is talking to in this particular chapter, 2 chapters here. And so I think it's important from Luke's perspective that whatever might be similar in other Gospels, you have to take into consideration the audience that each of the Gospels is, applying a certain parable or story or, instructions. Because just because the Bible says it in the Gospels, does not mean automatically application to everybody everywhere at all time, which I think that's where a lot of mistakes are made in reading the Bible. So you have to keep in mind the particular audience and what is the purpose to that group of what Jesus is saying, either instructing or rebuking or whatever. So we've seen him spend some time with his disciples. Then he's talked to the crowd. Then he's reverted back to his disciples. So you almost get the feeling that you've got the disciples that are sort of, close to him. The crowd's out here. So he's, lots of things are going on because the Bible even says that there's so many people that they're stepping on each other. So he's back and forth. And then he talks to an individual who yells out of the crowd, tell my brother to divide the inheritance. And then he addresses that. So in verse 22 of Luke 12, he says again to his disciples, and he talks about he talks to them specifically, which I think is kind of interesting, for them not to worry. I know there's an application for all of us, even in Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount, when we have instructions for not to worry about this, not to worry about that. But even in that context, Jesus is specifically talking to a singular group, not necessarily the crowd, but and I find it ironic that those, let's say, closest to Jesus, need to be reminded of these things. Does that make sense? So don't worry, don't be anxious. He tells them that just a little bit of faith achieves extraordinary results. He tells them not to fear, little flock. Keep your treasure in heaven. And all of this seems to be pointed to his disciples. He's still talking to his disciples in verse 35 of chapter 12. Stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning. He emphasized, blessed is the servant that the Lord finds awake. And of course, there's lots of parallels, particularly in Matthew chapter 25, about the second coming of Jesus. So we need to be alert and ready, for we do not know the hour that he will return. Now, verse 41, Peter, after he's been talking about being ready and all that, Peter is somewhat confused too. So I don't feel too bad about wondering, what's the application here and what's the application there, because at least we have an inspired apostle who says, Jesus, Lord, are you telling the parable for us or for everyone? And so he's asking for clarification. And as I ended last Sunday, Jesus responds in a parable. And this is, I always wondered why doesn't he talk directly sometimes? In fact, that was one of the things that when Jesus was referring to his Exodus and sending the Spirit and all these things, I remember there was an occasion when the disciple says, "Oh, now you're talking directly. Now it's making some sense." In other words, we've crossed out of the parabolic type of teaching to some clear language that they were grasping. But I want us to notice the answer that he gives to the disciples here. He says, "And the Lord said, 'Who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom his master will set over his household and give them their portion of food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say unto you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that servant says to himself, my master is delayed in coming, and begins to beat the male and female servants, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him into pieces and put him with the unfaithful.'" Now this is very graphic language, isn't it? Which is a little bit different than the way Matthew would frame or at least report on what Jesus said. Now you have to remember that surely Jesus repeated a lot of these parables and statements at different times. I mean, he's got a 3-year ministry that he's going around. And so just because there are differences, and even in what he says, but differences in locations is okay. It's not that the Gospels are getting them wrong. It's reporting by inspiration Luke's purpose and intention and why he's writing. We shouldn't expect everything to be identical, but I think that's what critics want to say. Everything that Paul writes, he has to have a certain theme about it, certain things that are included in his letters in order for it to be authentic. And it has to be, the cross, the faith, and, there has to be things that are what would be identified as Pauline, and they all have to be there for something to be credible. And that's just not fair to the writer, because the writer, in writing to a church or to a specific situation, is not going to always say the same things. And you have to allow the diversity. That's not even fair. They don't require those things of other, extra biblical books that are ancient. It's only the Bible. And so here we have, I think, a little bit more emphasis on the judgment. And this seems appropriate to me for the apostles and for the disciples, because being the leaders of the movement, so to speak, of the Christian way, the ones that will take the reins when Jesus goes back to heaven, they have to be, the apostles. They have to be the authority. They have to be the leaders and the examples for the Christian community. If they're not, they're just like the religious leaders of Israel. And so perhaps this is one of the reasons why Luke is emphasizing this particular, harshness to remind them of their responsibility. But it seems to be the same kind of parable he just told, isn't it? That you're to be ready. You don't know the hour or the day. And so your focus seems to be on what's going on right now and the way you conduct your life. And we continue that faithfulness until, the coming of Christ. There's speculations as to whether Jesus is referring to the destruction of Jerusalem here, or is it to his second coming? But regardless of what that might be, what's the point of his parable? It's readiness, isn't it? It's always, we are always expectant. We live with an expectant attitude for the return of Christ, don't we? At least that should be what it should, how I should live, right? I don't take a day off and, so to speak, and, and shut down and as my spiritual, life. I'm always living under the purview of the second coming
Scott,
of Christ. Yes.
do you think that, but also I think this shows that there's a varying level of accountability. That the people that have the knowledge, these people that have all these things that Jesus has got, they have a greater responsibility, and they'll be judged harsher if they don't live up to that expectation that he has for them because of their relationship and what he's telling them that they have to do once
Yeah.
he's gone. But I think that's what we face
Yeah,
now.
and what, that leads to the various degrees of rewards and punishment, which I don't believe in either, because I think what Jesus is doing, he's being, it's rhetorical, it's hyperbolic, it's emphasizing something and their responsibility as opposed to something else. The writers do that a lot in order to stress a very important idea. And yeah, even in the New Testament it says teachers will incur a stricter judgment. But if you go to hell, you go to hell. You see what I'm saying? It's not, well, okay, at least I'm on this side of the river in hell, and it's just a little bit better than over there. I don't think that's what it's teaching. I think this is rhetoric on the part of Jesus from his teaching to emphasize the responsibilities of leadership. And you can go on and imagine there's other New Testament passages that it's really worse for someone who has come to the knowledge of truth and has fallen away. And of course, I think that would be in the sense that you knew you were a part of the faith and now you're not. That would have to be somewhat of a sobering reality. Hey, see y'all guys. I hope I said something offensive.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
Okay. So, if you keep reading, he says, everyone to whom much is given, of him much will be required, and to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more. And this is consistent with other parables that we know of in regard to the parable of the talents, that Matthew talks about, and the minas that Luke will refer to. For us, and think about it in a practical, secular way. If you can't prove yourself faithful with a little, why would we expect to be deemed as worthy of more? If you can't be faithful in the job or the position that you're in and do it, then why would we then expect promotion? You know what I'm saying? It's just a principle that he who shows himself faithful in a little gains much because of the ethic, the work ethic, or the mindset and the attitude of what the individual does. So this is one of the reasons why biblical teaching is so much used in the secular world, and motivation and work ethic, things of this nature, because it's so true to life. So, in verse 49, notice we're still in the context of what Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and particularly in answering Peter's question. Well, maybe I should ask this. How do you suppose Peter received these words? It's like Jesus doubled down. You know, he had that be ready section, and then he doubles down with the same idea, but talks about the master hacking up to pieces the unfaithful servants. So how do you suppose Peter reacted? What, and I know we're speculating here, but I think it's kind of interesting from his perspective. Did he get his answer? Or is he kind of, what's he saying?
It almost seems to me that Peter's like, some of this doesn't apply to us, but it applies to everybody else. I mean, because the way he asked the question is whom are you speaking to? It's almost like he's trying to quantify what he has to live up to versus whatever.
Well, I think Peter would sort of assume that he would be the faithful servant and is alert and ready, which he becomes the example of failure. Doesn't he?
Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, I think this reaction or this response to him is addressing his overconfidence, or maybe a warped view that he has, that we learn as we go along and learn about Peter. Now, you know, Peter comes around, of course, but, you know, think about the times when he said, you know, I'll always fight for you, I'll give my life for you, you know, this isn't going to happen. And Jesus dealt with him very harshly on a couple of occasions, called him Satan one time, you know, as well as the other disciples, because they were hindering his work. So it's not that we should be overly confident. We should be ready. And maybe that instills some humility and expectation.
And Jesus knew, I mean, at this time, he's talking to Peter, but he really already knows what Peter's going to do.
Yeah.
And so, I mean,
Unless you believe in the, what's the theory called?
Open theism.
Open theism, where God doesn't know everything,
Yeah.
which it's interesting, but you know, but you're right.
Yeah, but I guess my thing is that he's still, it's like you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. He's not, I mean, he still has value of Peter, and he's trying to mold Peter, but he knows the things that Peter's going to do to disappoint him, but he still, you know, loves Peter.
Yeah, and you have to, I think you see the love of Christ toward Peter because of how hard Jesus is on him. Why would you be hard on someone like that if you didn't really care for that individual and wanted them to understand? And so some of the most brutal words to his closest disciples are toward Peter.
In human nature, you can't see that until later.
Right.
I mean, a person that, I've had people that have hard on me in my life, and I just thought, man, they're just, you know, what's wrong with them? You know, and then later on, it's like,
How did they know?
Yeah, exactly.
So we have verse 49. I came to cast fire on the earth, and would that it were already kindled. I have a baptism to be baptized with. What's Jesus referring to here?
His death on the cross.
Okay. This illustrates the way the word baptism is used. And when you study the scripture, you can't always assume the same, the same idea relative to a word that a writer might use. You have to understand it by its context. We know baptism means literally what? It just means immersion, burial, okay? But you can use it metaphorically about suffering. I've been baptized, immersed in suffering, you know. That's a baptism. A baptism of fire, someone might say, you know, the crises and the challenges that they have. And so Jesus, in referring to what he's about to endure, refers to it as an immersion. And it would make sense if it were translated immersion instead of baptism. See, baptism is not the translation of the underlying word. It's a what we call a transliteration, sort of. In other words, you know, you take an English letter, you take the equivalent English letter to whatever the Greek letter is. So it's close enough, but that's the word that's used. Every time the underlying word is used, it's going to be a baptism, usually.
So Scott, you think
Yes.
Christ was worrying about it?
Huh?
It says distress. You think he was worried about it?
Yeah, I guess that would indicate
I think it dreaded it.
I think there's a dread. I think he knew intellectually.
I don't think it's worry, I guess.
I think he knew intellectually what's going to happen. He knows. You kill his body or whatever, it's going to raise up the third day. He knows what's going to happen. The plan is known. But he's experiencing, I think, human emotions, and having the dread to go through it is something that we would all experience.
He wanted to be crucified to fulfill the Father's plan.
Yeah.
But
he didn't want to be crucified. Just
he
for the sake.
He was determined to go to Jerusalem to
Yeah.
fulfill the Father's plan. That was never a question.
Right.
In my opinion, I believe what he was distressed about, what he was upset about, what he did not look forward to, was all of the suffering he would undergo prior to
Yeah.
the cross,
Yeah.
the scourging.
Yeah,
the
I think it
beating,
includes it
all.
all. And I would say the worst thing would be his crown of cross, my God, why are you forsaken me? When he becomes sin for us. But anyway, there's obviously a lot of dread and stress and, thinking about what's coming. But you remember, even in the garden, when he went and prayed, that was his answer. I got to go pray. Stay up with me if you can, but I got to go pray to the Father. And I think it might be, is it Luke that reveals that angels came and ministered to him during his Gethsemane, prayer? The others don't mention that, but Luke does. So, is this a transition? Is this still talking to Peter and telling them the challenges that they're going to face? And think about it. This almost sounds like a political playbook here. What politicians and others try to do, divide the people and divide households and this kind of thing. But Jesus said the truth and my mission, my purpose divides people, and it does. So I came to cast fire on the earth, and would that it were already kindled. I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how great is my distress until it is accomplished. Do you think that I have come to give peace on the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. For now on in one house there will be 5 divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. So what's Jesus saying to Peter and the others, of course? Isn't part of being ready understanding that which is coming and preparing for the challenges at hand? I think Christianity is, you know, sometimes people charge us as having, you know, our heads in the clouds and, you know, we're doing this. But I don't think that's Christianity. Christianity is very much alert, prepared, and ready. You know, you have the armor of God, you have this and that that's talked about in the Bible. So it's not like we're walking around, you know, everything is fine. You know, the sun is shining, you know, all this. And we try to live a psychology of optimism and being positive and acting as if. I don't think that's what Christianity is. Christianity is certainly about being prepared and knowing. Jesus is going to say that in regard to knowing the times. You know, if anybody is aware of the times, it should be Christians. In other words, understanding what's really happening, you know, being able to discern truth from error, things of that nature. So in verse 54, that's where he goes. He says, he also said to the crowds, now he's going to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you say at once, a shower is coming. And so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say, there will be scorching heat. And it happens. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? And this is key. Think about what does he mean by this? What's the present time? What's he referring to?
The atmosphere that's going to lead up to his crucifixion. I mean, he's trying to make them understand that they don't see the big picture of what this is going to give them access to.
But doesn't he hint, though, doesn't he imply by his statements that they should be recognizing what's happening? Doesn't that seem to be inferred by what he's saying? Or implied, or we infer that?
I think he's disappointed that they don't, and by what he says here.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that they just don't, because I think they're all have a preconceived notion that he was coming as a conquering king. So if he truly is the Messiah, they're having difficulty wrapping their head around that he's not coming as a conquering king, and they don't know that he's sacrificing himself for the good of mankind.
Yeah.
Which
I wonder, did it never cross the minds of the rabbis and others? You know, they were readers of Isaiah, you know, the prophets. They were looking, they knew messianic passages, you know. But isn't it because of their presuppositions about Jesus that they were unable to recognize him as
or was it their
being a
corruption
fulfillment?
of the system
the
that
corruption?
they had in place,
Yeah.
that they didn't want anything to upset the 2,000 years of influence that they have accumulated over time? They weren't willing to give that up, even though I have to believe what you're saying is that some of them saw it and they just weren't willing to acknowledge it.
Yeah, I mean,
Not in public anyway.
yeah, not in public anyway.
Right.
So there is, and I think this is a rebuke to the crowd. And what's the crowd interested in? You know, I know the crowd sometimes is more favorable to Jesus than the elite are, but the crowd's not all that into Jesus necessarily. What do they see? Why would they be impressed? What's he been doing?
Miracles.
He's been healing people, miracles. He's been feeding people too. So it's kind of like, you know, have a luncheon and they will come. You know? People come or for various reasons and things, right?
They're popping popcorn and sitting there waiting, going, okay, when's the show?
Yeah, yeah. So once, you know, to get beyond that is a step of faith. Now, I'm not saying that some didn't have it. We have several who in the crowd, but you know, the crowd also left Jesus. You know, John in this gospel talks about this, that, you know, he had a crowd. And John, I think it's 6, talks about, he says, you got to eat my flesh and drink my blood and all this stuff. The crowd goes, what are you talking about? And he turns to them and he says, unless you hate your mother and father, you know, take your cross, follow me, you're not worthy of me. I mean, these are, and the crowd left. I can't, you know, eating, what's he talking about? And so they leave. And he asks his disciples, do you want to leave? And then that's where Peter, fortunately, you know, he says the right things a lot of times. But he says, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. So being impressed with the crowd isn't impressive. I mean, it's not. And I think churches sometimes are enamored with crowds. Try to manipulate crowds, you know, get crowds. And what ends up happening is their strategy is in building a crowd or group, but not building disciples. And people not learning the truth. Because the truth divides. People don't necessarily like the medicine of truth. That's why repentance has been called what? The hardest commandment? Because it's medicine. And you got to take more of a spoonful of that to, you know, get right with God. It's hard. But anyway, interpreting the times. And particularly when Jesus is alive right now and how things are happening, he seems to imply that there's enough evidence that is at their, you know, viewing and knowledge and what's been said for them to come to certain conclusions about what's happened. And
He spoke, you're saying he spoke plainly enough that they should know, understand what he was saying?
yeah. I think, I mean, even the psalmist talks about he's coming to speak parables.
Yeah.
I mean, the way that the Messiah would teach, you know, what he would do, his whole biography is written in the Old Testament. So I don't think there's an excuse. It's somewhat like what Paul says in Romans chapter 1, but I think it's applicable to the Jews too. The things which were made is enough evidence to lead one to ask questions, you know, and come to an understanding of a being like God, the things that are made. Every house is built by someone. So the builder of all things is who? God. Now, from the environment, I may not learn all about the qualities of God, but there are some things I probably can deduce from what I see in nature. Paul says this was sufficient to lead the Gentiles to an understanding, but they suppressed the truth, okay? And they began to worship that which is created instead of the Creator. Well, in a sense, the Jews did that too, did they not?
Yes.
When you think about the idolatry among the Jews and the rejection of God through their history, they're doing the same thing, and so Paul says both are under condemnation, both the Jew and the Gentile. There's only one hope for both, and that's Jesus. So, how come we don't recognize the times? How come they didn't recognize, you know, their actions suppress the truth, their expectations, what they've been taught, their presuppositions, their assumptions, everything. I mean, all these things. Why don't people see the truth? You know? Well, many don't want it because they'll lose a meal, or they won't see a miracle, or they won't be entertained, or whatever.
You know, back in 51, where he said, do you suppose I came to grant peace on earth? But I tell you, no division. Even today, if you try to talk to people, as long as you can talk about how great things are, but they don't want to hear about hell.
Hmm.
I mean, just no.
Well, I think truth in general, the Bible does divide,
Absolutely.
you know,
And he told
even to the core of family,
Yeah, sure does.
which Jesus says. Why is that? Is it the Bible that divides? No, not really. It's our reaction or our rejection or acceptance of what is real. People like to live in an unreal world. See, they'll accuse us of being in an unreal world, but it's not. It's an unreal world that's been accepted.
And a lot of people will tell you right fast, well, I'll ask my preacher.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can find somebody to say what you want to hear, isn't it? So, he says, verse 57, and why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? Think about that statement for a minute. And this goes to what Ruth indicated. I'll go and ask my preacher. Do you see the emphasis here? Why do you not judge for yourself what is right? You know, the Bible talks about the idea of working out your own salvation. It doesn't mean that I create my own plan of salvation. It means that I'm responsible, you see, of
You've got to come to that
understanding
knowledge, yeah.
what I need to do. Preachers and teachers are helpful, but they also can be a hindrance because I may rely on a personality. I of Paul, I of Cephas. You know, the church was almost becoming a denomination back then in the first century if it weren't stopped and people brought back to the unifying message of the cross. So, and why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? And you go with your accuser before the magistrate, make an effort to settle with him on the way, lest he drag you to the judge, and the judge hand you over to the officer, and the officer puts you in prison. I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the very last penny. We have similar statements in Matthew, okay? This one's interesting in the context in which it's found, and I think it has to do with the consequences of not recognizing the times. Okay? So a person is going to the magistrate, you know, you're kind of in trouble with, you know, someone that maybe you owed money to or something, and you're being taken. Okay? What does he say you need to do? You need to recognize what's happening and start to try to settle with this individual before you get to the court, the magistrate, and judgment is spoken against you, and you're thrown in prison and locked up forever. I want to ask you a question. Who is the one that they are in dispute with? Does that make sense? And the two that are walking, okay, and he's saying to one of them, you know, you need to make sure you understand the times and make things right with the accuser. I want to know who the accuser is.
God.
Yeah, I think in reference to, you know, even more specifically as Jesus in the story. This is the time of reconciliation. I mean, don't wait, because the waiting and not recognizing the times, you're going to find yourself in a whole lot of hurt.
It feels like what you're saying, Scott, is he's trying to relay a sense of urgency.
Yes.
That this needs to be done now. You can't put it off. And I don't think that people at that time, they just couldn't get that sense
Yeah.
of urgency at all.
And all these things are talking about the urgency of the matter. But I find it interesting that in this particular context where this is found, it's emphasizing this settlement on the way, you know. And I think the application is even now, and the reconciliation of ourselves with God. Because if we don't recognize the time, the season, or our need, you know, for, you know, confession or repentance, or become a Christian, or, you know, making ourselves right with God, you may find yourself, surprisingly, with no time left. That's pretty shocking, isn't it? That's a good story they told here.
You know, that's also true when we think about, if you have someone against you,
Yeah, leave your.
do it now, because we don't know tomorrow, they may not be here.
Yeah, there always seems to be kind of a sense of urgency
It is.
in doing the Lord's will. Yeah, but I think this is sort of a wrap up to all that he's been saying to the crowd, to the disciples, to a person who wants to talk about inheritance and all these things, which might be matters that need to be dealt with, but in comparison to the matter of the soul and your need of God and what's happening, it pales in comparison, does it not? You need to settle. You need to be reconciled, as Paul would say, to God through Christ. So this is all a prelude, I think, to ultimately the heart and need of the gospel and people to obey it. Okay, well, we'll wait and talk about chapter 13. I'll just give you a hint. In chapter 13, you know, he's going to go right into repentance. So it's a logical step. He's telling us how to settle before we find ourselves at the judge. Hey, David.
Hey. We have a little house. Hey.